I'm often asked, why did I do this film? And there was one film called The Black Press, Soldiers Without Swords by Stanley Nelson, directed by Stanley Nelson. And there was one black and white photograph in that entire film, The Black Press, Soldiers Without Swords. It was a 12-year-old girl, and she was in a really, so her Sunday best, and she was flanked by members of her family, and she was a white girl, and she was right up front. She had a front row standing position, 10 feet away. A naked 15 or 16-year-old black youth was being burned alive. I wondered what motivated parents to bring their children to such an event as a public lynching. And some of these events had 15,000 people, like the lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916 in Waco, Texas, had 15,000 people there. And although the city of Waco would say far less, but I have the actual photographic evidence and the actual photograph of the event, and so I know there was a lot more than 500, which they put in their Chamber of Commerce brochure. And they minimize the numbers always with these things. Today we don't let kids see an R-rated movie. Here they would basically take their children to an event where the person would be put to death in a horrific way, and they weren't worried about the trauma that would occur with the child. So that is what got me going. It's sort of a tremendous phenomenon in that it affected all kinds of people, tens of thousands of people, Native Americans, and more than any group, African Americans, and then many, many Mexican Americans, especially the Tejanos of Texas, who are like the Tex-Mex people, Mexican descent people who live in Texas. And all these people, and Chinese people, Australians off the convict ships who lived in San Francisco, including a 12-year-old Australian boy was lynched. I've had the tremendous opportunity to interview people as old as 107 years old, like Hobart Carter. His best friend, Johnny Cornish, was burned alive. And he told me that story at the age of 107 about what had happened. It's like going back in a time machine. There were kids as young as 7 who were lynched to enforce segregation in the American South, and there was women who were lynched. We discussed about certain women actually instigated lynching other women because that was something that they did. A woman might claim they were raped by, say, a black man or a Mexican man, and so they got a guy lynched, because there would be anger that would be generated by those comments, and the girl or the woman would be considered, that she'd be put up on a pedestal, and that trope would say, oh, she's a beautiful person and she's been violated, and that would be, so we have to kill the person who violated. And especially violation may occur even with consensual sex. And if it was people that they didn't want women to have, white women especially, to have sex with. And so all this stuff was sort of wound up together into a phenomenon where, anybody could be lynched. But what really made lynching so American and so commonplace and pervasive was that lynching was done to people who were expendable. A lot of eccentric people, homosexual people, people who were union activists, people who were different in some way, who were daring to speak out. Those were the people who were lynched. And this is part of our history that we never discuss, that we never talk about. America is a great country, but it has warts like anything else. It is not perfect. And one of the reasons we're not perfect is we don't examine ourselves. Because we haven't dealt with our past, it could be our future. Another anecdote I'll tell you was a man named Captain Pratt, who I like to talk about because he was like a legally condoned serial killer. Captain Pratt used to refer to himself as a Confederate officer, though there was no record of him serving in the Confederate Army. And in the 1890s and first decade of the 20th century, he used to go to different communities. He'd look in the newspapers, or he'd kind of thumb through things, and he'd say, oh, I'm needed here. He'd like a mercenary, and he'd go to a community, and somebody would be imprisoned and had just committed some kind of crime, or was in prison for suspected crime. And he started this with two Seminole Indian boys in 1898 in Oklahoma Territory. And what he would do is go to that community, and he'd be a rabble-rouser, and he'd get people he'd teach the whole ritual of lynching by burning, which was one of the modes of lynching. People could be, shot to death. They could be burned. They could be hacked to death. I mean, there were lots of ways. It wasn't just hanging, And so the thing about it was this Captain Pratt would go to community after community, and they say that he probably was responsible for at least 80 lynchings by burning, mostly in the South and Southwest, during the years 1898 to about 1910. He would be written about in the paper not as a killer, but as a good Samaritan, because he taught the community how to burn somebody alive who was considered expendable. It was a step-by-step ritual set of procedures that made it easy and convenient to burn somebody alive, and how to do it in the most painful way, in the most drawn out and protracted way, but the most entertaining way for the crowd. You had those kinds of uneasy alliances with law enforcement and with the people of a community who were doing the lynching. Americans felt that justice was done if they saw it being done right in front of them. They were sort of bloodthirsty about that. And with many cases, especially with African Americans in the South, you didn't even have to commit a crime to be lynched. Many times a person would be lynched for just breaking the social mores that had to do with the segregation code. And that was something that was done. I've seen cases over and over again where that kind of thing happened, and people could be Christian. There were Christian and religious preachers who extorted crowds to go out and do lynching. There was a lynching in Dover, Delaware in 1904 of a black man, where the preacher, I think he was a Methodist preacher, he got the crowd to do the lynching. And it wasn't even a crime that the man was actually known for sure to have committed, but they felt they'd killed a fiend, somebody who was not even human, and that was something that was part of the American experience at that time. To satisfy the people of a community, some of them very bloodthirsty, sometimes the capital punishment had to occur very quickly. And if it didn't occur quickly, if there were delays in the process, for example, like a trial, they would be upset. And sometimes before there'd even a trial, they'd pull the guy out of the jail, or usually the guy, and they'd basically, lynch them somehow. And even the Supreme Court in 1906, in the case of one incident, couldn't do anything about. They said that the man was innocent and shouldn't have been imprisoned. And yet, when they got that Supreme Court decision, the people in Tennessee, they took this gentleman out and they lynched him because they disagreed with the Supreme Court decision. And also, when lynchings occurred, a lot of the time, the people who would be questioned about it would say, oh, it wasn't in our county or in our community, it was somewhere close by where the lynching, other people, or people from another community did the lynching. We had nothing to do with it. And so it was very hard to convict people of lynching. Certainly this was true with literally thousands of cases with African Americans lynched by whites. You had situations where the legal system just didn't work. People who did the lynching would never be put on trial, or if they were put on trial, which was rare, they'd be almost immediately acquitted because there'd be lack of evidence. Nobody would really testify against them. That happened a lot. I've talked to 6 perpetrators so far, and I found a lot of people were trying to establish themselves as young men in the society or the group that they came from. So we've never really come to grips with this phenomenon called lynching in America. And yet it's something that I'd like to say, unfortunately, is as American as apple pie. I've had to come to some conclusions after years of research about certain things. And they don't necessarily agree with every other scholar. I'm not there to agree or disagree. I'm there to try to make a film as I see it.